Hey, want to talk about some fake basketball?
Hey, what's up everyone? Thanks for tuning in. This is episode 3 of the HawksTalk, and obviously, my name is Kyle, I'm the Hawks GM, and today I'm going to be talking about the RBSL GM questionnaire that I put out a couple days ago, and it's a little bit overdue, but I tried to put some time into it to make sure I actually have some sort of analytical thoughts and comments on all the different types of responses we got and what each of the questions garnered in terms of responses, and learning about what the GMs in our pretty diverse league act like. And before I get started, I just want to say the league has definitely taken a turn with some events, including Dave leaving, our beloved commissioner. Dave, if you listen to this, sucks that you left, but best of luck moving forward, and hope you keep in touch. I followed you on Instagram. I hope you follow me back. And another change that we had is obviously Alex coming back. Alex hasn't been in the league since the mid-2090s, and to those who don't know, Alex has a ring. He is the founder of the Tony Jones fan club, and I've got to say he's, as much as I crap talk him in the chat, he's a pretty good GM when he tries and is not delusional, which is perhaps only half the time, but welcome back, Alex. Now I'm going to get started with the questionnaire. Like I said, pretty interesting responses, and I'm excited to get into it. It's going to be a long one, so I'm going to make sure that I put timestamps in, as well as a PowerPoint or maybe a video with some pie charts outlining the responses. Guess I'll start with some logistical stuff first. Thank you to everyone who answered. We had 20 GMs, 21 including me, submit a questionnaire. You guys give me content to work with, and I'll provide the content, and then Max gives me TBD because I'm apparently broke as heck this season. I could really use it. Now, the first question that I want to go over is, when did you join the league? So I outlined 5 different periods: pre-FBB3, 2074 to 2080, 2080 to 2090, and 2090 to 2100, and then 2100 to the present. So I'll start with the responses. So only one GM stated that they joined pre-FBB3. That's not surprising. There's not many GMs left from that pre-FBB3 era. Off the top of my head, those would be Brian, Jesse, Oliver, and Fendi. And as such, it's not really surprising. Of that group, only 2 people are really active. Brian and Jesse, I guess. And Brian was the only one who submitted a questionnaire out of that group. So, yeah, those oldies are pretty rare in the league nowadays. So I welcome their input, and they're pretty fun to have around when they're active. And then 2074 to 2080, we had 19% of GMs answer that they were from that period, so that includes me, Ed, probably Icky or Marco, and I'm missing one. Not a very exciting period, I've got to say. I guess the most interesting thing would be GM started figuring out how FBB3 worked a little bit better. There was the real draft, the Jalen draft, which really changed league history. Yeah. The next period was 2080 to 2090. Also not very surprising. It was a little bit of a tumultuous period in terms of turnover. Lots of GMs came and went. So 28.6% of the GMs who answered stated that they were from this period. Now the next up is 2090 to 2100, which was definitely the most tumultuous period in league history, I guess, in terms of turnover and events. So firstly, a lot of early FBB3 GMs retired or kind of departed with being frustrated with the state of the league. That includes people like Mike Mann. But also there was an exodus, which you guys are, most of you guys should be pretty familiar with, including Alex, and that's when he left the league. That resulted in like almost 6 or 7 GMs leaving the league and forming the RBSL Classic, which is currently inactive. So as a result, there was a really high turnover during this period, and a lot of new GMs coming in, such as Idwin, Doc, Shane. So a lot of GMs stated that they joined during this period, so 33.3%. And then the remainder would be 2100 to the present year. But only 14.3 GMs answered that. That equates to 3 GMs out of the 21 who answered. And that's not surprising because since 2100, we've had a rather low number of vacancies. Most GMs pretty happy with how the league's going despite rule discussions or whatever, but most people have been pretty content, and as a result, we've had some pretty low turnover. Now, the next question I want to go over is, have you won a championship? So a third of the GMs answered yes, and that's a lot. It's very high and much higher than I expected. But then I thought a little bit more about it, and it's not actually that far-fetched. These sorts of polls, questionnaires, and league involvement in general are most often consumed or participated in by active GMs. And if it's a no-brainer, but active GMs are usually better than non-active GMs, so hence a higher proportion of GMs than actual answered yes. Now, the ring argument in RBSL, absolutely, rings are vital for the evaluation of GMs and players, but I argue that it should be more significant for the former rather than the latter, because good GMs, of course there's luck involved, but good GMs will always be able to consistently put together good teams over their GMing career, and those really good GMs will win rings, and plural, right? Because those GMs are good enough that they can continue to go back far into the playoffs. Meanwhile, some great players in the league's history have often not won rings because it's perhaps not even their fault, it's just the failure of their GMs over the course of their career. So that's my perspective on the ring argument. But that's not to say I disrespect GMs who have rings. I think it's very telling when a GM has a ring or more than one ring in their GMing career, because that says to me that they have evidence of putting together great teams, even more so if they have more than one, because that represents sustained success and consistency in regards to their GMing skills. So it is important for me, but yeah, I mean, if I have to say, I tend to have a higher regard for GMs who have more than one ring with different builds than just a GM that had a ring with a single build. Of course, unless those specific GMs have, although they only have one ring, they have shown continued success. For example, Bryant, who has always been a really, really good GM, but sometimes the dominoes can't seem to fall, so he only ends up with one ring, even though he's a top 5 GM in my books. Now, the next question that I want to go over is, what tier do you consider your GMing to be in? So this is really interesting because I figured that everyone would overrate themselves and put themselves a tier or two higher, but that didn't seem to be the case, because I put together a comparison between the GMs who answered and the GM ranking that I put together about a month ago, and I noticed that it was pretty similar. So 24% of GMs stated that they were S tier, and I also had 24%. 28% said A tier. I had 24% of the answered GMs. 24% for B tier. I had 19%. I had 19% answered that they were C tier. I had 24%, so higher there. So maybe a little bit going on, but of course that's based on my own GM ranking, and I rank GMs differently than everyone else. We've had a lot of GM rankings in our forums and in the WhatsApp chats, so take it as you will. And then 5% of GMs stated that they were F tier versus my 9.5%. So you know what? Pretty good. Gotta say, most of you guys were pretty objective or reasonable with how you ranked yourselves. I placed myself in A tier. So yeah, take it as you will. I think you guys are pretty reasonable. The next question I had was, how many different builds have you had? And I defined a build as a different core or cornerstone. So for example, the Zion teams of the Orlando Magic in the late 90s and early 100s, I consider that to be a single build because it was all based around Zion, and it was just cycling pieces around over the couple of years. Of course, that's a skill in itself too, but I still consider that only one build. Just kind of like how my Heriberto Jackie team, that would be considered a single build for me. Another example could be the Bart Smith teams that I considered to be one build, and obviously that ended up with 4 rings, which was crazy. And the reason why I think of it like that is because I think of it as the build-rebuild cycle. You rebuild for a build, and then you decide to blow it up at some point, and then start over. Majority of GMs answered that they have done 2 to 4 different builds, so 66.7%. And that's not surprising. 2 to 4 builds is pretty typical for GMs who have been in the league for more than a decade. couple GMs, so 28.6%, answered that they have had 5 or more builds. So those would be more of the oldies, such as Brian, I guess me, Ed, guys like that. And then a single GM, probably someone like Tom, answered that they've had 1 build. Why did I ask this question? It was kind of just, I don't know. The more I think about it, it's not a very useful question. It's just maybe interesting to think about on how often GMs seem to start those rebuild and build cycles, right? So the next question that I have is, what is your favorite position to build around? So this one was really interesting, and I'll try to be pretty in-depth about it, but the majority of GMs picked big men as their favorite position to build around. 52.4% of GMs, so that equates to 11, they answered that they like to build around big men. And I think that's a very fair and good bet. Building around a big man is usually solid. Unstoppable big men, by definition and in league history, are very difficult to slow down or deal with if you're an adequate game planner. And I think a really big reason for why you should choose to build around a big man is because a lot of teams tend to stuff and round out their roster by putting a almost weak or just barely adequate center to fill out their lineup. Some examples for this season include Wilt Nichols on the Nets, Cox, Shelton / Perez on the Pacers, Campbell on the Nuggets, Timothy White on the Wolves, Majita Zupan on the Clippers, and whoever Zach has for his Sonics team. Now, before I get roasted by Doc for it, I think Zupan's really good. I just don't think he's like a two-way star or anything like that. But yeah, like, consider those players, and then can you think about, can those players actually significantly slow down or decrease the effectiveness of players such as Evan Hatsis on the Grizzlies, August Benz, Fred Miller, or even historical examples like Bart Smith? When you have a number of different playoff teams in the league, and this is, I think it's always the case pretty much, where each of their centers are nothing more than just a typical green, maybe even a yellow player, those players have no chance of dealing with your star big man. So I think that's why it's a really good bet. But the second reason is, I think franchise big men are a lot easier to find than franchise wing players or point guards. There are surefire bets or signs to consider to try and find when you're evaluating big man talent. So that includes height. You just look for someone who's at least 6'10", pretty much. Strength and jumping, you want ideally A's in both, but as long as they're pretty sufficient, that's a good bet. And they need to be a decent post defender, decent inside scorer, and decent blocker. And there you go, there's your cornerstone big man. So it's also, I feel like it's really easy to develop and find decent big men because you just look for those attributes and athletics. But now, when you're talking about cornerstone franchise big men, there are other things to consider and look for, such as speed. Having greater than C speed is really strong for really athletic and high inside scoring centers. Potentially even handling or rotatability in regards to perimeter defense and steals. Those can be really strong tools because you can switch up your starting lineup in the playoffs, such as Heriberto Sarmiento, who I had. His post and perimeter defense allowed me to rotate him between positions. Or even Basil Moore in today's league. His steals and blocking are invaluable. But to me, it does come down to centers are absolutely the easiest position to training camp. The scheme is very simple. You use some sort of 10 inside, 10 post defense, and then 10 or 5 points in the luxury attribute. So handling or perimeter defense or shooting or something like that. So that scheme is really simple. It's hard to mess up. And then after that, it's just pure luck, right? Even cases of repeated minus TCs or failed developments like Butters Parker, they still end up as productive, good players. So therefore, my conclusion is big men are the safest to build around and develop and kind of try to find a cornerstone or build your franchise around, sorry. If you disagree with that, please let me know, but that is my firm opinion. Now, other GMs, slightly below half, they picked point guards. And I understand that too. Having an all-star point guard is really, really strong for team building, and often they can be really hard to slow down. Let's think about examples like Stanley Albrecht, Richard Bender, those kinds of guys. Of course, the latter is not a point guard, but you get my point. But my opinion is that the reason why a fewer GMs prefer to build around point guards is they're harder to nail down than centers. A cornerstone point guard, in my opinion, has to have at least 2 of the following points: 3-point sharpshooting, insane slashing ability, really good at assisting, and being a defensive killer, so perimeter defense and steals. Now the problem is most PGs only often develop maybe 1, or seldom 2 of those abilities. Let's consider someone like Wilfonso Nichols, who I just traded this past offseason. He was a great 3-point shooter, a talented assister, and a very good defender, but he took a long time to develop, and I got really lucky with that too. For the longest time, I thought he was going to be one of those point guards who simply are not efficient due to either jump shooting or just straight up being bad for some reason despite having good attributes. But Wilfonso did break out eventually, but that was a risk that I had to take. And you see so many point guards in the league, such as Hayden Fox, Jack Mickelson, another one of those Thunder or Warriors dudes. Like, those guys flared out in a bad way, and that's because point guards, in my opinion, are really, really hard to build and TC, because often you have to spread out between shooting, maybe even inside, handling, perimeter defense. There's a couple more criteria in the training camp table that you have to consider, and therefore it ends up relying on really good TC luck in order to develop those franchise point guards. So as a result, I think that's why GMs tend to favor big men over point guards for choosing a franchise player. And to those newer GMs who got burned by failed PGs, best of luck, but I hope you kind of learned your lesson, and you can take my advice with a grain of salt, I guess, but I truly do think it's a lot riskier to build around and hope for a point guard to blow up and turn into a superstar. Now, there was one GM who who said that he liked to build around a wing player. Funnily enough, that was me. I've always liked talented wing players. The reasons being they can rotate like crazy throughout the regular season and in the playoffs. So I could throw surprise lineups at higher seeds. The prime example for me would be someone like Charles Shaw, Jackie Martinez, Andrew Loomis, who I had for a little bit, or Phil Freeman, those kind of guys. These kinds of players, these really, really good wing players, can be really good defensively. They can rotate like crazy, like I said, but they can also be really good offensively with handling, with shooting, or inside scoring. But the problem is these transcendental cornerstone wing players are 100% the hardest to develop because their TC points and their, I guess, attributes in general are so spread out in order for them to be real superstars. So Jackie, he was, I believe he was the second ever like full purple for multiple seasons player who I developed, and I got really, really lucky with him. Like, he had 2 or 3 plus TCs in a row that made him who he is now, and it's a risk because that's it's never gonna happen. It's gonna happen like maybe once or twice in your GM career where you have a series of multiple plus TCs like that. So building around a wing player is obviously not very attractive, it seems. Even for myself, although I like to search out cornerstone wing players and prospects, I often just end up also looking for a high potential big or a high potential point guard to shift to if that project fails, pretty much. And to those of you who are not aware, some examples of prospects that have flared out in a terrible way would be some people like Ben Simmons, Piotr Zamoshki, who else? Yeah, I don't know, there's a couple, but for every Jackie, there are 5 to 10 or more than a dozen players that couldn't have those successive plus TCs, and therefore they didn't end up as even all-stars. So you gotta be cautious with those kind of projects and those kinds of franchise players. The next question I'm going to be going over is, what assets do you prioritize getting when you're rebuilding? So this was an interesting question for me because I was very wrong about how certain GMs value what they look for when they're blowing it up. So almost half the GMs who answered wrote high potential first rounders, meaning greater chance of being in the lottery. And that's a no-brainer because high potential firsts are the safest bets maybe for getting a rebuild package that actually turn out to be worthwhile. But I also think it's one of the most RNG reliant ways, and therefore is a pretty medium to high risk way of racking up and acquiring high potential prospects or trading pieces. This prioritization strategy is risky because GMs are very erratic in our league. They can blow it up at any time, which would be good for you, I guess. They can also push in their chips or make some crazy trades because they don't have their pick and they don't want to give away a high lottery. So a potentially great pick can go straight to garbage level, or I guess it can go the other way around. But also lottery luck is a thing. When you get jumped, that feels bad, but that's also not a very uncommon thing. So that's also something you got to consider. 28.6% of GMs answered they prioritize getting blue chip prospects. It's lower risk, but it's also a higher cost and lower reward strategy, in my opinion. But at the same time, this is what my priority generally when I'm also rebuilding and trying to get a rebuild package going. The reason why I say so is because, and why I prefer it, is because I don't like being reliant on lottery balls very often. I feel like that's a reason why other GMs prioritize blue chip prospects as well. But another thing is that blue chip prospects available on the trade market, or I guess not available, I guess, and I'll have a little bit more back to talk about that later, is they've generally already had one productive TC or maybe even a plus TC, which makes them even more attractive and a safer bet almost. So like I said, lower risk, I guess, but also could be lower reward and higher cost because you often have to overpay or just pay a hefty price for a package in general to get these kinds of prospects. For example, when Loomis was a prospect, when I had him back in the late 90s, Austin had to pay a pretty price for him to get him for me because he was a little bit more of a known quantity compared to other guys in the draft preview. So I ended up getting Jackie plus no Brown for him. So that's something to consider because you're going to have to pay up to get these kind of guys because it's a safer bet. And then 14.3% of GMs answered they just go for any first they can get. This is familiar. Getting as many firsts as you can get is a pretty common strategy in this league. Most notably in recent years, Jack got something like 16 to 20 firsts in the real draft. Gasper also is known to be a stickler for getting as many firsts as he can, just buying them with his massive TBD bank. But it's a safe strategy because if you draft a crap ton of prospects, you can use them to trade up or include the prospects themselves or the firsts in packages. And it's a wider net that you cast. So instead of trying to pinpoint out high potential prospects or lottery picks, you just get as many as you can and then see what they end up as. And you know what? If you have a lot of prospects, the chance of you getting a plus TC during training camp is probably greater. The remainder of the GMs, 9.5%, answered they like to prioritize project prospects. While they're fun to develop, I think this is probably the riskiest and most RNG reliant strategy in my opinion, and as such it's better suited as a secondary priority in my opinion, because giving up large packages or even like delegating time and resources to getting projects, risky projects and raw projects can take away from your overall goal of speeding up by rebuild, I guess. So in my opinion, focusing on one of the other three priorities and then having some projects on the side is the best way to go. If you disagree with that, like I said, let me know. Let's have a discussion. The next question is, do you value second rounders? This was surprising. 52.4% of GMs said yes, which is much higher than I expected considering how quickly we sim through the second round and the fact that second rounders in trade negotiations are considered to be nothing and are throw-ins generally and doesn't really tilt the scale for anybody. With that said, some good pieces have come out of the second round or even undrafted players, including some stars such as Pascal Siakam in the 80s, Imamotimi, Kiarostani. So these are all old names, but even in recent years, there are second rounders who have ended up as contributors and maybe even starters. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but they've been there. I personally don't value second rounders, so I was in the no category. But once in a blue moon, I see really interesting players in the 40 to 60 range, such as Mark Gordon on my roster right now, in which case you can usually easily buy a second rounder with TBD. So therefore, I personally don't value them at all. They're just trade fodder to me that are never tilt the scale, and you just add them in as a little sweetener in a otherwise probably done deal. But obviously, some GMs do value them, especially the second round picks in the 31 to 37 range. Those players can actually still be very good prospects, so that's understandable. The next question is, do you use your scout or do you use the HTML more? 57.1% of GMs said they focus on the HTML more, and the remainder their respective program scout. I'm going to try to see the other side of this because I'm strongly on the program scout side. For me, it's because you can't see in between attribute grades as well as you can on the program on the HTML as you can see on the program. Now, that's not to say I don't use both. But I do value my scouts grading more than the HTML for that fact. If you aren't aware, I don't know how you wouldn't be, but on the program, you can see a potential bar that shows exactly to what kind of general percentage that attribute can develop towards, versus in the HTML it just says a letter grade, and letter grades have a big range. You can check out one of my old articles where I outlined the percentage to letter grade equivalents, and man, it's pretty broad, so you got to be careful with that. And so for me, I use the HTML attributes and potentials to confirm my already made conclusions from the program scout. But I can see why GMs might like the HTML scout more, because it's more global, more neutral maybe, and perhaps their own scout is unreliable due to decreased scouting points. Even for myself, I do understand that the first decreases I choose when decreasing my coaching points is future potential scouting and current attribute scouting. So I can understand why, but for me, it's program scout all the way, with a little bit of HTML sprinkled in. Also, another funny thing is I have dark mode enabled on my phone, so I can't see colors on HTML most of the time. Yeah, but regardless, I think it's important to use both, whether you value the HTML more or your program scout. But that's a common theme. Not one strategy isn't way better than the other in most cases for any of these questions, so it's important to have a balance is what I'm saying. So the next couple of questions I'm going to go over now pertain more to positional team building. So the first one is, how important is having an assist-heavy point guard? I'll start off with the responses. 14.3% of GM said mandatory. 42.9% said important but can do without. 23.8% said neutral. And 19% said not necessary. So only 3 GMs out of the 21 who answered said that having an assist-heavy PG is mandatory. One of those was me, and another notable GM was Jason. I personally love having an assist-heavy point guard because it lets me focus on non-passing and non-handling attributes for all my other players. Further, if I'm fortunate enough to have more than one talented passer, I can run a really high motion, kind of fling the ball everywhere strategy like I had last season, where I had Saturnino, who had A- level passing, Wilfonso Nichols, who had an A passing level, and Papa Bouba Diop, who had an A+ passing. So each of those guys were averaging more than 6-7 assists a game. I had really high motion, and it was a really fun offense for me personally. Regardless, the reason why I think it's mandatory is because I think it's very difficult to create shots for your players without them. But I guess in the same sense, having a good enough point guard that averages somewhere between 4 to 6 point guard assists is often enough for the really elite teams, I think. If you look at past champions, most of them actually don't have point guards who average more than 7 to 8 assists. So it makes sense For Jason, I know he really likes passers. Lonzo Ball, he really liked Lonzo from the get-go. He liked Avocado, GG, so that's understandable. The 42.9% of GMs who thought assist-heavy point guards are important but can do without. Therefore, I perfectly understand and I can agree with them to a certain point, because a lot of the previous champions of the last couple decades, notably the Pistons, the Wolves, or the Wizards, those teams generally did not have uber 7 to 8 plus assist point guards, meaning you can certainly win without them as long as there's sufficient shot creation on the roster. And a lot of the GMs who voted for this option, a lot of them were really good, in my opinion, S tier and A tier GMs. So yeah. 23.8% said neutral and not necessary, which I took it as long as they think that as long as they get enough assists on the team to have a sufficient offense, you can have a good team. And those assists don't have to come solely from the point guard. The problem with that mentality, in my opinion, is it's hard to get shooting guards, small forwards, power forwards with greater than C plus passing. So as a result, a lot of teams are under average, in the 15 to 22nd range for total assists, team assists. So I personally think you do need some sort of good passer on your team in order to do well. In the end, I think having an elite passer as in your point guard slot can carve a more cookie cutter and define a team scheme, which can be really useful if you're a bad GM like me. Now, how important is having a dominant big man? Everyone more or less agreed with each other for this one. 61.9% of GMs stated important but can do without, and then a third said mandatory. I was the lone GM who said neutral for this, but I think that's because I view having a dominant big man as more of a luxury, which is ironic because what I'm saying here is very different, opposite of what I said earlier in the podcast. But my teams generally seem to only have those kind of decent starters, big men that I talked about earlier. My teams generally have a yellow green starter big man to round out the roster, and I found I could still win 55 to 60 games with that sort of team building. But I also realize I haven't won any championships or anything like that, so that's probably a big flaw on my part. With that said, I have had my fair share of really good big men like Heriberto Sarmiento or Bobby Allison, so I'm not devaluing the power of a really good big man. And like I said, in the what position do you like to build around question, I explained why having a dominant big man can be so strong for playoff teams. So for everyone else who values having a dominant center or power forward and is important to their team building, I commend you. And I do agree with why you can think that. Yeah. What defensive scheme do you like the most is the next question. So 52.4% of people who answered said man, 14.3% said half trap, and 33.3% said help. No one said zone. Even Kyle, who took down the Jazz in the mid-80s and the Jalen team using zone defense, he didn't say zone. Not much to say about this one. I personally have had best defensive efficiencies and schemes using help defense or man defense. I've never really been good with half trap, but that's because I think I don't really like half trap players generally, just because racking up steals and blocks while having bad man defense is kind of icky to me. But most of the GMs who have been in the league for longer seem to prefer man defense or help defense, with mostly newer GMs preferring half trap and man. So what does that mean? Is help the best? Maybe, I don't know. But if you look in league history, some of the best teams have been help defense or half trap defense, so take that as you will. What type of offense do you like the most was the next question. I apologize, I think I phrased this question pretty badly because I wasn't referring to the inside balanced and outside settings in the game plan for the program, but I was just talking about team building philosophy in general. So as a result, I think it skewed the answers so that majority of GMs selected inside, although perhaps their wider offensive philosophy is more inside plus threes. But regardless, 52.4% said inside, 28.6% said balanced, and 19% said outside. In regards to the program settings for those, inside generally results in players trying to drive more, resulting in higher free throw attempts. Balanced, I'm not too sure, but it says balanced, but yeah, okay, it says balanced, so they still go inside, they shoot threes, but it also increases the jump shot attempts, which a lot of GMs don't like. And then outside obviously tries to force longer jump shots, I think, and 3-point shooting. So yeah, for myself, I put balanced. I highly value inside scoring and outside shooting, so I go with balance most of the time. I try to minimize jump shots, and I think most people would agree that that's a good way to go, because jump shots, most players, even the really good jump shooters with B+ or greater ratings, they still shoot like 39 to 45%, which is really bad and decreases your overall team's offensive efficiency. So I'm 90% sure that it's not the way to go. Balance is not the way to go. With that said, some jump shooting godly players do really rely on jump shots for their points per game, so I got to consider that as well. But generally, I think most GMs seem to agree that inside plus threes is the best overall offensive scheme for success in the RBSL. The next question is depth or star power. 76.2% of GMs said star power, 23.8% said depth. So it seems even the newer GMs have caught on to the fact that this is a star-driven league, this is a star-driven program, and having a killer starting lineup with stars is more important than pure depth. With that said, one godly GM and two great GMs answered depth, so that's kind of interesting. But I took a little bit of a deeper dive into their teams, and in the playoffs they still play their like borderline stars and all-stars way more minutes, so maybe that's something to consider. I truly do think a pure depth approach actively harms your team, actually, as when it comes to the playoffs, your team's gonna fizzle out most of the time. You need star players to carry the load in order to get far in the playoffs. I'm gonna think of some examples now. Like, for example, my own teams that were depth reliant and built around depth, they often struggled in the playoffs, and I had a hard time getting out of the first and second round. I hate to say it, but a lot of Dave's teams built around depth, those teams didn't make it past the first or second round very often either, because a lot of Dave's like diamond in the rough players, they only played 20 to 28 minutes a game sometimes, and if that's all they're good for in the playoffs, they're going to get murdered. And we did see a lot of Dave's teams kind of fizzling out. So while I value depth in order to deal with regular season injuries and trying out new schemes, I am strongly and strictly in the star power category. Having really good players that can carry the load is much more important, I think, in my opinion. And if anything, I think a lot of newbie GMs tend to value depth a little bit too much historically. So yeah. Next question was light or heavy tanking. So I define light tanking as 15 to 25, 30 win seasons, and heavy tanking to be 0 to 15 wins. So 61.9% of GMs answered heavy tanking and 38.1% answered light tanking. This was a mostly expected response. Heavy tanking will generally get you lottery odds in the 1 to 5 range, depending on how many teams are tanking that year, while light tanking will generally get you picks in the 6 to 11 range. Picks 12 to 15 are generally the picks of teams who made a final playoff push but failed, so light tanking is my preferred strategy. I like to try and win at least 20 games during the regular tanking seasons for the sole reason of I don't want to lose my hard-earned coaching points. And in most cases, you can still get pretty good prospects and projects in the mid-lottery, and you still have odds to jump into the top 4 as well. So, but the biggest thing for me is coaching points, right? As a result of my light tanking in my last rebuild, I did actually reach max coaching points this last offseason, and I don't want to lose them. So that's my primary reason for light tanking. Plus, I don't know, I just don't like fielding a really, really, really intentionally bad team. I know some people enjoy trying to hit that 0-win mark, but I don't see the appeal. So I assume that that's kind of the case for other GMs as well, for why they prefer light tanking. Another thing is a mental thing, I guess, where it does feel pretty terrible to get jumped in the lottery after hard tanking like crazy. So maybe that's also a factor to consider. Although I like to light tank, heavy tanking is probably the way to go in my opinion. Light tanking can backfire pretty heavily if the mid-lotto prospects that year are not great, or if you can't consolidate assets and have plus TCs in a timely manner. With that said, heavy tanking for more than 2 seasons is a really bad sign in my opinion, and a detractor for your GMing. But it is inevitable if you get jumped in the lottery repeatedly. So you do you, I guess. I think both of them have pros and cons depending on your rebuild strategy. And that's a nice connection into the next question, which was generally how many years do you plan to be bad for? 61.9% of GMs answered 2 seasons, a third said 3 seasons, and 1 GM said just a single season. That single GM would be Zach, who has been pretty adamant and consistent in his belief that having short tanks is the way to go, and that having long, heavy tanks is a bad look on the GM. And I do agree. But I also don't think I am good enough, nor most GMs are good enough to pull off a single year tank. So I aim for 2 seasons, and I guess most other GMs do as well. 2 seasons and 2 off seasons, in my opinion, is generally sufficient time to acquire a core of prospects. And by the 3rd off season, you can start to consolidate assets and get veterans to start pushing for 35 to 50 wins. And I think 2 is the sweet spot because you really need to take advantage of the rookie contract, and having a tank longer than 3 seasons is really risky as you lose out on those really cheap rookie contract years, which is an insanely important and powerful tool for pushing for a ring. It's also a big reason why we nerfed TBD extensions over and over again, because back in the early 80s, TBD extensions simply made it so the next year, the TBD extended year, was 1.2 times the previous year's salary, which meant superstar rookie contract players were literally making like $10 or $11 million a year or less. So yeah, so I'm glad we nerfed that. But anyways, as such, I think it seems that's why no one actively plans for 4 or more seasons of tanking. It does inevitably happen if you make some mistakes along the way, or you get jumped in the lottery way too many times, but it's good to plan for 2 to 3 years. I guess that's the sweet spot. Now the big question, and I think I might shock some people here, but it was how important is color when evaluating prospects? And this was a mixed bag, and I think is a more truthful representation than what we say in the main chats where color bad, never look at color. That's not the case. 14.3% of GMs said very important. 23.8% said 23.8% said kind of important. 38.1% said neutral. 19% said not really important, and 5% said not important. And I think, and this is my opinion, GMs need to be careful about color, but it is a very useful tool and a really good gauge on the overall status, standing, and potential of a player. I personally said neutral, but I do lean towards the kind of important measure. I think that once you realize how colors are calculated, it's a fine tool. You just have to realize that fake color players exist. Players who don't deserve to be even green. Sometimes they're shown as blue or blue potential. There's a lot of fake purple players in the league's history, so you gotta be watch out for those. So you can kind of think about colors as like a quick lick on your finger, put it in the wind, and checking that. It tells you generally how a player might be in their code and in the back end, but you need to look beyond that and look at their attributes. So let's think about it. So when you lick your finger and put it in the wind, you can't really tell certain details like how cold is the wind, what's the actual speed it's blowing at, what direction exactly, like what are the coordinates, stuff like that. You need to look at the color, then look at their shooting splits, then their attributes, then their concrete defensive skills, their height, and their athletics, and how they fit regarding your team and their position and stuff like that. So it's a litmus test, and that's how you should look at it. Just because a a player has a really good color doesn't mean they're good, but maybe there's something more than what their attributes are saying, or like stuff like that. So like it goes both ways. And considering that the 3 GMs who said color is very important are GMs I consider to be really, really good GMs, maybe color really isn't that bad. You just got to be smart about it. Alternatively, maybe they thought the scale was the other way around, in which case those GMs have literacy problems. Next up is, how about college statistics? And the responses for the college statistics question definitely shows that the mentality around them has changed since the late 70s. No GM said that they consider college stats to be crucial for talent evaluation, which is probably the right call considering college gods like Ronald Taylor flamed out magnificently. 42.9% of GMs said they consider college stats to be okay, giving hints about players, and that's all they do. 38.1% of GMs said they only look at shooting splits, and then 19% said they don't look at it ever, at college stats ever. I don't think that's a bad call, as attributes are what's important anyways, not whatever they did in futuristic FEV3 code college. I personally am a part of the shooting split group. I look at the players' college splits, but specifically, I look at their free throw attempts, I look at their three-point attempts, and I sometimes do look at their steal and block numbers, but even those don't always translate over. Neither do the shooting splits, mind you, but I think it gives you a good profile on how willing they might be able to take threes, their three-point tendencies, and how well they can drive. The next question is, when rebuilding, do you focus on a certain position first? So it's a little bit similar to some of the previous questions, but a little bit different at the same time. 81% of GMs said no, they don't focus on a certain position first. 9.5% said they focus on the center position, and another 9.5% said the point guard position. So those two answers are kind of expected, as people do focus on, if you were to focus on getting a certain player, a big man or a point guard would be the best bet to go. But in general, everyone seems to agree on the best pick / best prospect available rather than choosing for fit. And definitely, I think that is the right call unless you already have a league-breaking cheat code player. But even then, best pick or best prospect available is probably still the way to go, since you can flip them, right? Now, the last question, the concrete question, is, when you trade for picks, do you consider the team's GM history? And this one really surprised me. 90.5% of GMs said yes, and 9.5% said no. And the reason why it was really surprising is I don't know why. My first thought was, why wouldn't 100% of GMs say yes? So my instinctual thought was, why the hell wouldn't you consider the team's GM history when trading for picks? So I thought the GMs that answered no must be pretty bad GMs. And then I checked. And at least one of the GMs who answered no was a top 5 GM, in my opinion. So I thought about it a little bit more, and I concluded that I guess it really depends on what sort of rebuild strategy you like to do. In this GM's case, it's pretty well known that he instinctually and indiscriminately trades his players when blowing it up or flipping for any first, pretty much. This GM also throws wads of cash at any first possible during the draft. And you guys should probably know by now who I'm talking about, and yeah, damn, he's a great GM if you look at his history. So maybe the rest of us are too stringent and strict on the types of picks we try to get back, and the rest of us should cast a wider net and just go for any first, just like this GM. Maybe. I probably won't ever kind of do that, but it's something to think about. So that marks the end of the kind of like concrete multiple choice questions. And I did have a couple written response questions. I'm not going to cover all of them, but I'll kind of list them out and say what I think. So the first one I'll cover is, how do you like to rebuild? So it kind of summarizes everything here. So the notable ones are, one GM wrote he likes to find interesting guys that I think are fun. And I like the strategy. I think I often tend to do the same. That's generally how I like to trade for and develop players. If I'm scrolling through the program and I see a young prospect that I think can turn into a really fun, like fantasy kind of player, then I'll take him. I'll try to trade for him, which sometimes that means giving up a lot of assets or a lot of other prospects to get him, but it's it's fun to do that because that's how kind of Jackie started. Of course, Austin reached out to me with a Loomis for Jackie and No Brown trade. But after that, as I started developing Jackie, I was just like, no way I'm trading this guy anymore. This guy's going to be my fantasy. But it's also I think it's a medium risk kind of strategy and mentality because these interesting guys generally take a lot of plus TCs or just solid developmental TCs in order for them to fill out like what you have in your head for what you want them to be. A couple GMs said sell everything for lottery picks and then find the guy to build around and spend everything. And this is the most popular rebuild strategy in the league, I think, although I think you do really have to be very good at adapting and changing based on the circumstances you're given, because you might get jumped in the lottery or some guys flare out. So you got to be able to deal with that, but otherwise I would consider it to be a pretty low to medium risk strategy. This GM said he likes to get as many picks and prospects with high potential as possible, so pretty similar to the previous one. Now, the most interesting one that I read was acquire picks and prospects to churn into players closer to their primes. This one is really, really interesting, and only a couple GMs do it every year. The reason why I think it's so interesting is because 90% of GMs in the league, I think, can't pull it off even if they try. The prime example, I hate to say it, would be Jack's last few iterations. So the Zion acquisition or the McCarty acquisition, and potentially even this one with Michael Campbell, considering how his season started so far. It's by far the riskiest strategy, I think, for the sole reason that you really have to eyeball and estimate fit. And to get these sort of prime players, you really need to overpay or throw massive packages to get these players. So in my opinion, this is the riskiest strategy. There's only one GM that I can clearly think about who constantly employs this strategy, and that would be Wolves GM Kyle, who never ends up developing his own players. In most cases, he trades like mad for closer to prime players, and then he puts together a contender out of them. So it's a risky strategy. I personally would not recommend it unless you're a good GM. Sorry, Jack. Yeah. And lastly, a defeatist strategy, I guess. Draft and sign the old free agency dudes because I can never get good prime free agency dudes. This is a dark strategy. It's not really a strategy, I guess. I understand play for winner is a strong and almost destructive feature of the game. So GMs can often fall into the hole of no one will sign with me, so I have to overpay for old guys. It's a dangerous and self-destructive strategy that GMs can fall into, and I don't think it's the right call because I think there are ways out, even if it means being bad for 4 to 6 seasons in order to try and get more assets and more worthwhile pieces. I just don't know if constantly overpaying for 32, 33-year-old guys and then barely not even making the playoffs, I don't know if that's the right call. Yeah. So that concludes my recap of the GMing style questionnaire. I understand this was a long one, but to everyone who has listened to this point, thank you very much. I don't know how consistent these Hawks talks are going to be, but I have fun making them, so hopefully I keep it up. To those who listened until now, I hope that the comments and sort of analytical thoughts that I shared regarding each of the questions to be useful, especially the newer GMs. I hope you take this questionnaire results as a way to improve your own GMing, but also take it with a grain of salt because obviously I'm the one hosting it, and as a result, a lot of my comments are based off of my GMing style, right? So be careful, I guess. I'm warning you, I haven't won any rings either. So yeah, thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys later.